Welcome back. We are on our third lecture in a series of mini lectures on the topic of perversion and perverse enactments and perverse structure in Lacanian psychoanalysis. We left off having explored a little bit the double valence of the role of the other, both in perversion, which would be both the other person upon whom a certain perverse enactment occurs, such that a kind of negativity of affect and jouissance is engendered and anxiety in that other person. But we stressed a number of times that there's a broader, larger, as it were, public scene to a perverse act than simply two people. It always entails a third point of reference. It always entails the Lacanian big other. So we're going to build on that with some nice examples and try and substantiate and elaborate that point as we go on. And we're going to do that by first visiting a notion that seems very important, indeed is central in Jean Clavreul, sorry, Jean, don't know how to pronounce your name properly, Jean Clavreul's paper, The Perverse Couple. And when we start to think about the perverse couple, it's a nice phrase because it itself implies that there's no simply individual, insulated, perverse act that happens only with a person and a kind of sexuality. It always necessitates a couple of sorts. So let's see how Clavreul wants to develop that point. The first assertion he makes is, very sort of Lacanian reading of perversion, is that there's going to be a subjective disparity that will characterize the perverse subject's choice of partner, a subjective disparity. What does he mean by that? Well, at an obvious level, I suppose we could say that if we're thinking about perversion as necessitating in this Lacanian approach, if perversion seems to be fundamentally about engendering or causing a great deal of anxiety or negativity or intensity of affect or jouissance in someone else, if that's the case, then me being perverse, say, for example, finding someone else who has a shared kind of series of sexual predilections, that's not really going to create a whole lot of anxiety or negativity of affect intensity. It's not really going to be perverse in that respect because we both play the same, we both play by the same rules, so to speak. So what Clavreul is trying to emphasize is that there will be a certain choice, and that choice will exemplify a certain disparity. Here's a quote from Clavreul's paper. In perversion, erotic excitation comes from the contemplation of the other's discomfort or suffering, adding that he adds that this excitation sustains itself in the certitude that the other is innocent. Okay, so you could then say, well, not only is there a kind of disparity at play, but there is the selection of someone for whom the kind of jouissance you may be trying to engender would be particularly unwelcome, right? In other words, there's something here, it's almost like you would gravitate more to someone who's innocent of the type of sexual jouissance that you would like to initiate them into. There is a lengthier quote, so let's give that and see if that helps elaborate. The perverse subject is not indifferent to their choice of partner, says Clavreul. Perverse eroticism is most certain to be sustained if one of the partners defends themselves in the name of certain values and thus precipitates themselves even more quickly into the other's game, first as a participant, then as an accomplice. So a couple of things to unpack there. It's what makes a perverse couple in a sense is that there is already a selection of someone whom seems to be a little bit innocent or unaware of the nature of the perverse sexual transaction that will take place. Hence his phrase, someone who defends themselves in the name of certain values precipitates themselves even more quickly into this perverse game, first as a participant, then as an accomplice. Now, if we wanted an example, in the previous lecture, I gave an example of me doing a kind of forensic interview of sorts, and then someone telling me an awful lot more information than I needed. And you could say maybe the younger Derek trying to be this good, forensic psychotherapist or whatever might make for a good example of that. Remember that Clavreul says someone who defends themselves in the name of certain values. So here I come, someone, naive, asking these questions, not realizing that trying to be the good psychotherapist who's self-conscious, I guess, in a prison context, but trying to do that job, I make for a perfect partner in a game where someone tells me an excruciating amount of details about things that I didn't necessarily ask for or particularly want to hear about. But what's also interesting in the way Clavreul phrases it, one precipitates oneself more quickly into this game of another, first as a participant, then as an accomplice. So why the little example I gave seems to be quite effective is I didn't know how to stop it, or I didn't feel that I could, or I didn't act to stop it. So in this revelation of a whole series of details, I suddenly become a participant in the retelling, and indeed you could argue the perverse retelling of a series of perverse sexual acts, or even crimes, as it was in this case. So I become an unwitting participant. But then you could also say what one needs to listen out for and be aware of clinically is not only that you might find yourself in a situation when someone has involved you in as a participant, but maybe you may also find unwittingly that you are also an accomplice. In other words, that maybe you have been ignited or invited, and that you might be, despite yourself, enjoying a little bit more than you realize that you might. So Jacques-Alain Millet's got a nice phrase in his discussion of perversion in the book Reading Seminars 1 and 2. There's a lot of things that he says here that are useful, but maybe just to pick this one out, which I think resonates with the point that we're making. He says, clinical perversion throws the analyst's most intimate judgment into question, throwing into question the point up to which they themselves have moved on the path of sexual enjoyment. So it's almost as if what we're saying here is that it may well be the case that in a situation like this, the perverse subject may be pretty adept at touching a nerve, or indeed at eliciting a type of sexual jouissance that you maybe didn't realize, despite that it may cause a great deal of anxiety, that you didn't realize you were somewhat interested in. Which is somewhat of a sobering prospect, but something to be aware of in doing that kind of clinical work. And I think someone who does a nice job of highlighting this, exactly this shift from an unwitting participant to someone who is effectively an accomplice of sorts in a kind of erotic, perverse enactment, is this idea is explained very nicely by Ruth Stein. She gives an example in a 2005 paper, or she puts it this way, let's say. She speaks of how the perverse analysand's attempt to establish a perverse pact of sorts with the analyst sometimes occurs. Her idea is that this will be a kind of tacit invitation that happens at numerous times within the clinical work, that you will be invited at some level to be part of a perverse pact. Maybe there would be something different about this treatment. Maybe you would need to accommodate them in a certain different kind of way. This is the observation she makes, which is very candid and commendably honest, I think. She says, I had the feeling of being the prey, a sense of exquisite vulnerability to her, the perverse subject with whom she was working. I had the feelings of excitement and the disturbing realization of how compelling I found her, and by extension the work itself. So we could say, in this creation of a perverse pact, her, analysand, was, in a sense, initiating her into a type of disclosure, perhaps a type of excitation that in other spheres of her life she would avoid, and that maybe she may have ended up enjoying a little bit more than she would have realized. So we've tried to emphasize then the subjective disparity, the fact that we have this subjective almost a mismatch, which kind of makes the perverse potential of this couple work all the more. What we should also note about that, and it's kind of straightforward point, but nevertheless a useful one, that Slavoj Žižek insists on. He says the perverse subject displaces division onto the other. So it's not then simply a case that the perverse subject would try to create, ignite jouissance, anxiety, so on and so forth in the other, create fundamental affects of discomfort and unease, sometimes that linger for many years, but also that their own division is displaced onto another, which is another way of saying that fundamentally one way of creating a temporary sense of maybe security, maybe a temporary sense of stability, is precisely to touch a nerve of anxious sexual jouissance, often in another, such that my vision is now displaced onto someone else. And if that's the case, then what's going on in perversion is also, you could say, a kind of protective gesture, not simply a reveling in the other's anxiety and pain. Although, of course, both of those things could potentially happen. So those are a couple of important qualifications and descriptions. Let's now seek a few more examples with this notion of the other's jouissance and what the other jouissance refers to in the formula that we've discussed, Lacan's idea that what we see in perversion is the subject positioning themselves as the object cause of the other's will to enjoy. Now, what we could say from that is it's not just a kind of odd couple or a perverse couple, but there's also, as it were, a perverse ceremonial. And that's why I keep on using the word enactment, perverse enactment, because you could say it's being enacted for someone else. I haven't given the description in much detail here, but elsewhere and in some other videos, I've also given this description of what it was like to work in the prison context, where there was one particular sexual offender who would always position himself at a certain point in the prison and look at me in a certain way as I had to enter this corridor. Now, the example in some respects is a little bit problematic, because you could say, well, what was the person doing? Are you sure it's not just your response that you're taking as primary rather than what the person was indeed trying to do? But the mode of this look, which I've tried to write about and describe in quite a lot of detail, was somewhat disconcerting to me. It very much seemed to be a look that kind of, where the gaze kind of was initiated within me. The gazing seemed to feel like it was happening inside me, and it seemed to be very, very overtly sexualized. Now, there's lots of different reasons why we could think about that example, maybe critically, but one of the reasons that I wanted to briefly mention it here was that you could say, if there is a perverse enactment, that there's always a kind of public dimension to the perverse enactment, even if it's not abundantly clear that it's done in public. And in that situation, the gazing situation that I was describing, what was significant about that is it happened right in front of a whole series of prison guards, officers who were working at the prison. And it was kind of difficult for me to say, well, like, this is what's sort of problematic about this looking, which in a way we could say made it kind of even more perverse, because it was difficult to call out what was going on, and it was done right in front of an audience. So my point about not just being a perverse couple, but a perverse ceremonial that's enacted on behalf of someone beyond the obvious participants in that situation seems to be given some kind of affirmation in that example. But now let's try to think a little bit about this question of the role of the other. We could say then, and I think this is certainly what Clavreul's point is, that when we're thinking about perversion, there may well be an attempt to degrade, to corrupt, to pervert, whatever, another person. Clavreul certainly makes that point. But it's not just the obvious victim that's there that can be identified, which is the sum total of what's going on. We need to bear in mind that the other here points to a far wider potential audience. That's the example that I've just given. But just to reiterate the point, it's not enough then simply to corrupt the ideals of one other person, to provoke anxiety simply in one other. It is a properly perverse act aims at a higher order of ambition, namely to corrupt or to provoke a far larger and more encompassing constituency. And the best way to approach this, I think, is in this book by Henry Bond. What Henry Bond has done, the book is called Lacan at the Scene. It's got a really nice introduction by Slavoj Žižek. And what he does is he collects a whole series of crime photos. I think they're actually all murder images, forensic images that were taken by British police officers, I guess, maybe in the 40s and 50s, and has then said to himself, well, in what way can we see Lacanian diagnostic structures by a careful scrutiny of these images? It's a fascinating project, because most of the time, if not all of the time, the way he would justify the arrangement, like his sense of, is this a perverse crime scene? Is this a neurotic crime scene? Is this a psychotic crime scene? In most cases, he does a very convincing job of being able to show us, to demonstrate why that might be the case. he's got some interesting things about what we could call the perverse crime scene. And let's just add the obvious caveat before going there, is that we should be a bit suspicious and a bit cautious of a tacit equation of perverse enactment and criminality. Okay? As long as we keep the fact that that is an equation, a tacit equation, we should be aware of and should be have a lot of critical questions about. It seems significant to note that. Then we can try and look at his example. So he starts by looking at a crime scene, and he finds a little bit of what he calls obscene or erotic graffiti on the wall of the crime scene, which it appears was made by this murderer who had left a dead body behind. And he goes on to say that this drawing, an obscene drawing, can be read as the residue of a perverse act. Then he goes on to make a point about graffiti, and I think the point about graffiti is wonderfully illustrative of the point that the perverse act is always performed for a broader constituency than simply the one other person upon whom the thing might have been enacted. He says, let's consider the pose or function of this or any other graffiti. I note that what is characteristic of graffiti, I'm a little bit paraphrasing while reading, is that it occurs in a public place. It is the modality of the communication that is primary. Graffiti is not designed to be looked at by one specific individual. The audience for obscene graffiti is precisely an unknown and implied other, an other who cannot avoid it if they come into that situation. An other who cannot avoid some provocative image or statement and is thus corrupted by it. You can think of all these kind of like obscene writings, like, on the walls of toilets and things like that, right? The essential dynamic, back to Bond, is that for the artist or the scribe, the act of drawing or writing is always pre-connected to an assumed audience. There is an exhibitionist dimension to the process. The taboo or obscene aspect is simply an effective device. As Lacan commented, it is not only that I see the other, I see him seeing me. In other words, you could say in the perverse enactment, one of the fantasies, conscious fantasies that may come before it is how what I'm about to do will affect someone, how they will respond to it, how it will impact them, and that's part of the gratification of this act. He goes on to say also, these depictions, and he means here depictions both as in the obscene graffiti and the murder scene, can be described as renditions of a similar fantasy scenario. They are dependent on a supposed other, whereby the victim remains an element in a message. They are dependent on the role of another. Let's turn the page. We're on page 58 of Henry Bond's book. And then he goes on to make a point which I kind of think is crucial, but it also had occurred to me at some point before. We often think of the Marquis de Sade as like a historical instantiation of the perverse enactment, of the perverse act. And one of the reasons we do is that he's writing perverse stuff to affect not just one person, but a whole generation and a historical array of readers for generations to come. That there is something provocative in this thing which is addressed to a far wider audience. Just as the Marquis de Sade supposedly gained pleasure from the knowledge that in every paragraph he wrote, the reader is brought ever closer to understanding, identifying, or even participating in the horrifying activities he describes, so too the sadistic criminal is perhaps aware that the crime scene is a site that will inevitably be scrutinized by the investigating officer, the evidence gatherers, and so on. In other words, what is crucial to the crime is not simply only the circumscribed violent act, for example, but how it will have an impact on a wider array of public representatives who will come in to see it and likewise be disturbed by it. Each of these, the investigating officer, the people who come to the crime scene, each of these who come into the crime scene must carefully record what they find, treat it all with great care, and photograph it with precision. It is the CSIs who are finally tricked, or perhaps more accurately seduced, into making a series of obscene photographs and thus also becoming unwitting collaborators and accomplices. So we've got two very different texts, the Jean Clavreul on the perverse couple, and here we have Henry Bond, but both of them are emphasizing how there is the making of a kind of perverse accomplice, a making of a couple, and both of them are going to suggest that what's involved here is an appeal to an audience beyond persons involved in the perverse enactment.